Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. So it's always a good day when men speak up for women's sports, when men come forward to defend women who have to deal with competing against male athletes. Even better when it's a male athlete themselves who come out and defend women, who defend female athletes and say, this is wrong. So we have Julian Erosa, who won his fight on Saturday, and at a press conference, he called out Lia Thomas and said what we've all been thinking this whole time. Lia is a cheater, mainly because of the advantage that men have over women naturally. And that doesn't change when you say you want to identify as a woman. That doesn't change when you go on hormones. That doesn't change because you say trans women are women. Either way, you still have the body of a man, and even without advantages, men do not belong in women's sports. And I'm glad to hear that a lot of men agree. Julian Erosa, he spoke about Lia Thomas on Saturday night, and he didn't mince his words. He said, why don't you take me on? Take on someone who is your own size. I don't know how tall he is, but, why don't you take on a male athlete? Why don't you compete against men for a change? He was competing against men when it came to swimming, but could only rank 462. But of course, competing against women, Lia became the #1 NCAA swimmer in the country. In the women's division,
I was going to say that I don't like cheaters, and so and I don't know how you guys feel about this whole situation, but I don't like cheaters, and so I wanted to call out Lia Thomas. I wanted to encourage her to encourage him to transition from women's swimming into women's MMA, and then I'll transition to become a woman, and I'm going to beat that dude's ass. That's what I wanted. That's what I wanted to say, because it's all about getting getting a little bit of shock value, but I mean, the world that we're living in is just, there's no common sense anymore, and it's becoming a bit, ridiculous, and obviously that's one of the big things that's always been in, it's kind of going on now, and I just don't agree with men, in women's sports, even the whole Fallon Fox thing, knocking, and the girls or guys that are fighting in women's MMA and knocking them out. It's like, it's a bad look.
That's what I love about the UFC as an organization in general. They allow their players to say what's on their mind. They allow their players to speak without fear of backlash, without fear of being cancelled.
Just want to go back. You were talking about, you obviously give a long leash to your fighters about, what they can say when they are up there with the UFC microphone, and you are getting into territory of homophobia, transphobia. Is there...
I don't give anybody a leash.
Well, I'm saying you...
A leash? Free speech. And control what people say. Going to tell people what to believe. Going to tell people... I don't fucking tell any other human being what to say, what to think, and there's no leashes on any of them. What is your question?
I was asking that question. I'll move on, though.
Yeah, probably a good idea. That's ridiculous to say I give somebody a leash. Free speech, brother. People can say whatever they want, and they can believe whatever they want. And I don't think there's any... We had two gay women who fought in the co-main event. They sat on the stage with Sean Strickland. They could give a shit.
I mean, Dana White clearly doesn't believe in suppressing the free speech of his fighters, and he clearly says what's on his mind. So, yeah, much respect to UFC for that. Don't quite agree with their Bud Light sponsorship, but it's so good to see that they care about free speech. Their fighters are allowed to be men, say what they think. They're not considered toxic or anything like that. I'm sure, obviously, there are going to be people who see this as toxic, coming for the trans, woman. But that's the stance you get to adopt when you're a 6'4" man who wants to identify as a woman.
Since we're on this topic, do you find it clearly? Personally, I think when you're talking about a man transitioning into a woman's sport, when there's a combat element, it just seems so much worse than say swimming, like you said. Do you feel like there are any instances where it would make sense, or where it could
absolutely not? No, I just fully believe. I mean, if you were, if you went through, male puberty, it's never gonna. There's nothing you can do. There's nothing you can give yourself to shrink your bones down. There's nothing you can do in that kind of sense. I mean, and the proof's in the pudding, right? You have, Mr. Thomas, who was, whatever he was ranked as a man, and then he's just beating all the women. It's obvious, it doesn't matter how much estrogen you're taking. And I think we're in obviously a gray area, but these gray areas are stupid to me because it's common sense. I'm not the smartest crayon in the box, but I could tell you, if I don't know anything about anything, I can still tell you that's unfair. Like in my opinion. People are gonna have their opinions and say what they want, but it's just something I strongly believe in. That it's so funny to me that women will fight for their own spaces, and then they also fight for trans women to be in those spaces. And like those are just men. Like when is it gonna be where there's going to be, hundreds of men in like these sports, and then it just becomes another man sport? It's going to be like, it's so weird to me. I don't know. I mean, we could, dive into that can of worms all day, but yeah, that's how I feel about it.
Absolute common sense. And I love it when common sense prevails, when we get to hear people speak truth without fear, without being suppressed in any way or censored. Very, very refreshing. And thank you, Julian Erosa, because we need more men to speak out. You got to get your guys in check, okay? You got to get your boys in check. They're out here dominating women's sports or just infringing on women's sports. Doesn't matter whether you come first or fifth. I don't care. You don't belong in women's sports, and you always will have the body of a man, no matter how far you've transitioned. Like the journalist was asking, are there any circumstances, in which you think it's okay? And he said no. And I agree, and we all agree. Over in golf, we had Hailey Davidson, who basically agreed that men have an advantage over women physically when it comes to sports. Davidson agreed. However, because, Hailey had gone through all of the transitioning in terms of the full gender reassignment surgery, hormones, all of that, Hailey felt that, I'm different. I'm more of a woman because I've gone through all of that process. But the fact is, even if you've, had the operation, had all of your parts removed and all of that, you're still male and you still have an advantage. And clearly, Hailey had an advantage over the female golfers. It was clear as day. Performing bad one day or, not up to your best doesn't mean that you don't have an advantage, or not performing as well as other men who aren't on hormones. Again, doesn't mean that you're a woman, doesn't mean that it's appropriate for you to be in women's sports, for you to be cheating. And the good news is that NXXT Golf, the tournament in Florida, which Hailey won, they have now banned transgender athletes because that is a women's tournament. So they have now banned that. And that is great news for women. That is great news for female athletes, for women's sports in general. When we start seeing that these sporting bodies, these tournaments, these organizations, they begin to get a reality check. They begin to wake up and say, enough of this. And what's interesting to me is that the transgender athletes who identify as women, they too don't want to compete against men. They don't want to compete against men. The entitlement astounds me.
Elite sport is over for me because I can't do what I at least I used to love.
But you can compete in an open category.
Can I? Would it be safe for me to compete in an open category?
Because they complain when other men enter their category and basically, compete against them, but they expect women to be okay with it. They expect females to be okay with having to compete against males. We're bigots if we're not okay with it. But they have no problem expressing their objection to having to compete against other men. If it's going to be fair for you to compete against anybody, it's men. Certainly not women. We saw how they didn't turn up for the swimming event in Berlin, the World Aquatics. They never turned up for that because they don't want to compete against each other. They only want to compete against females. They know it's their time to shine. Like they were unable to while competing in men's categories against other men. This is as clear as day. There is example after example of these transgender athletes failing to be successful in men's categories, a category that they belong in. Either that or an open category. But we've seen it on paper. They weren't getting media attention. They weren't getting accolades. They weren't winning tournaments. They weren't breaking records while competing in men's categories. But that in itself is enough evidence of the unfair advantage. But what happens is when women speak up and say, this is wrong, we get mocked, we get threatened. April Hutchinson talked about how, trans rights activists or whoever, they called her job. They called up her workplace to basically get her fired She don't want to compete against men. Riley Gaines has spoken out about how she had to go through, or she was offered, re-education programs, counseling, because she didn't like seeing penis in her locker room. But the thing is, when a man like a UFC fighter speaks out, what are you going to do? They may mouth off online or whatever, but when they know that that person can't be cancelled because UFC isn't woke, so he can't be cancelled, what are you going to do? But when you see that you can interfere with someone's job, you can disrupt their life, you can get them suspended, that's when you have a lot to say suddenly. Guarantee you, the people who object and are offended, who are foaming at the mouth about what Julian said, they're not going to say anything to him. They're not going to say anything to his face, that's for sure. And they're not going to be able to get him fired or do anything. He believes what he believes, and he said it. All they have is to accuse you of being a bigot and to threaten you with being cancelled in some way. That's all they have. That's their only response. They don't come with science. They don't come with facts. They don't come with reality because it's not on their side. It's not on their side. The facts speak for themselves. Men and women have their own categories. They've always had their own categories. But you're trying to convince us that the need for those categories magically disappear due to identity. No, we have seen women get beaten to a pulp by men who claim they identify as women. Thankfully, that's not going to happen in UFC. And I hope this video ages well with me saying that, but I doubt it. I do not see that happening in UFC ever. But MMA, they're okay with men beating women to a pulp. USA Boxing, they're okay with it too, as long as you go through their requirements. So there are a group of female athletes who are currently in a court battle against the NCAA, because they basically allowed men who identify as women to compete in female categories.
So they knew this was coming. This legal demand said, if you don't stop discriminating against women on the basis of our sex, there will be legal action. To which, of course, they have not stopped doing just that. They've only increased this discriminating on the basis of sex exponentially at that. In a variety of different sports, in all divisions of the NCAA, in every state, this is happening. It was time someone took action. I thought to myself for so long, I wish someone would sue. That's how we win. Someone has to sue. Never once occurring to me that I could be a part of this, that I could really help spearhead this along with icons and 15 other athletes who have now signed on to this lawsuit. Athletes who themselves were adversely impacted, athletes who lost out on national titles and All-American honors, and roster spots and podium spots and championships and records due to men at the hands of the NCAA being allowed to compete in our sports. I realize it's us. We can fight back. It's what the left does so well. The other side, they throw around lawsuits like it's nothing.
So upon hearing this, an advocacy group for transgender athletes or LGBTQ plus athletes decided to weigh in on the situation and, in my opinion, basically mocked female athletes and told them that you're just salty because of your failure as an athlete. Okay, so Hudson Taylor, the founder and executive director of Athlete Ally, said, "We empathize with the pain felt by any athlete who falls short of their athletic goals, but singling out, scapegoating, or otherwise targeting trans athletes as the cause for those failures is unfounded and perpetuates stigma, stereotypes, and discrimination against transgender Americans. Apparently, it becomes fair just because they identify as a woman. But in sports in general, there are obviously categories, right? So why should it be any different just because somebody has, claims to identify as a woman? Athlete Ally believes that these 16 female athletes were just failures and they're taking it out on the trans athletes. It's nothing to do with Lia, for example, winning competitions by body lengths, winning a sprint by seconds, which is unheard of. It's a sprint after all. When these female athletes are successful athletes who have won competitions, who have won accolades, all they ask is that they compete against other women. females. That's all they're asking. We see these organizations being disingenuous. Nobody is saying that if somebody identifies as trans, they cannot compete in sports. Nobody's saying that. Categories have been created just for them, just for their inclusion. But unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be good enough. And what they need to do is care about the women who are being excluded. Women are being excluded because of males being in their categories who don't belong there. And that's misogynistic. That's wrong. And female athletes deserve better. So once again, it's very refreshing when those who aren't delusional are able to live in reality and understand that men do not belong in women's sports, ever. Unless it's like mixed doubles or something like that in tennis. You know what I mean. So let me know what you think. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe. Take care of yourselves, and God willing, I will see you in the next video.